All right, guys, today we are going to go over Module 2. Module 2 today talks about psychology and its approaches. Here are your learning targets. Go ahead and read those on your own. If you want, write those down. I'm not going to go over them today. So let's get started. Okay, so contemporary psychology. So if we remember, in the 20s, behaviorism became a big thing. Also, psychoanalysis was really big at that time with Freud. And so these two kind of competing ideologies were very present in the early 1900s. And they both kind of had a very negative view of humans. They both kind of viewed us as kind of inherently bad in a way. And then in the 60s, psychologists started to focus back on cognition. They wanted to think about how our mind processes and retains information. So they started kind of moving away from just strict behaviorism, where they only wanted to learn about behavior and nothing to do with like thoughts. And so the advent of cognitive psychology happened, which focuses on how we perceive, process, and remember information, and how thinking and emotion interact with anxiety, depression, and other disorders. So, for example, cognitive psychology often is paired with other fields in psych and medicine. So, like cognitive psychology and neuroscience is cognitive neuroscience. And researchers who are in that field specialize in brain activity, which underlies mental activity. So they do really cool and interesting research. So what exactly is psychology, though? We've talked about this a little bit in class. Our definition of psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes. So psychology is continuing to grow around the world. It has kind of flourished over the last 100 years, and it's a really big field globally, with main posts in South America, the US, Britain, Israel, lots of really awesome research happening worldwide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the different kind of fields and thoughts within psychology today. So one major field is evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics. And we talked a little bit about this, but a big question that underlies psychology is this idea of nature or nurture. Do we inherit all of our traits? Meaning, are we born the way we are today, or do we develop those traits over time through our learned experiences? And so, throughout time, philosophers have really argued about whether we are born with everything that we have. We are born with all the knowledge we're going to have, or if we are a blank slate, or what they used to call a tabula rasa. Now, in 1859, Charles Darwin, you've all heard him from bio, he writes his famous book on the origin of species, where he proposes the theory of evolution by natural selection, which is, its definition is, from naturally occurring variations, nature selects traits that best enable an organism to survive and reproduce in a particular environment. Now, today, evolution and psychology have kind of become their own field within psychology called evolutionary psychology, which I think is super fascinating, because what evolutionary psychologists do is they study humans and animals, and they try to understand why we have the traits we do today based on how it would have served our ancestors. So, for example, why is anxiety so prevalent in humans today? We'll talk about this in class, but I want you to theorize, why would it have been a benefit for our ancestors evolutionarily to have anxiety? Why would that help them survive or reproduce? Write down your answer in the notes. So evolutionary psychologists ask questions like, how are we humans alike because of our common biology and evolutionary history? Behavioral genetics, which is similar, they ask, how do we individually differ because of our differing genes and environments? So evolutionary psychology tries to see our similarities. Behavioral genetics kind of tries to look at the differences based on our genes. So today, the consensus on the nature nurture debate in psych is that it's both. Nature and nurture both have a big role in creating who we are as unique individuals. So the phrase goes, nurture works on what nature provides. And we'll talk more about this debate a lot in this class. So this isn't the only time we'll mention it. Okay, now cross-cultural and gender psychology as well as positive psychology. So one field of research that some psychologists study is called cross-cultural research. And the reason for this is that because in many, many, many psych studies, the main people that are being used as research subjects are what we call weird cultures. So we have Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people who are being researched. Whereas the rest of the world isn't like that. So we need to make sure that we are studying people who don't come from weird cultures. So, for example, we have done research on facial expressions and how do people in, isolated tribes in Papua New Guinea display facial expressions versus Americans. And interestingly enough, it actually shows that we're all pretty similar, which shows that there's a human element to that. So I want you to think of an example of a behavior that you have that is culturally informed. So, for example, in the US, we give, I'd say, a moderate amount of eye contact versus other countries. PDA is different in our country versus other countries and their cultures. So, this is kind of what cross cultural research focuses on. Gender is also an element that is studied because there are differences in how people who identify as males and females behave. So, for example, how we express and detect emotions, there have been found gender differences. The risk for alcoholism is different between males and females. Depression and eating disorders, the risks are different. So, the big idea is that though there are differences, though, between males and females, psychologically and biologically, men and women and people who identify as neither are much more similar than they are different. Now, another kind of field that kind of came out later in the 1900s is this field of positive psychology. Positive psychology is kind of like humanism, but it's a little bit more focused. It's in its research. So Martin Seligman, he and some other psychologists developed this field, which really tries to study how humans are good and how we flourish. And so they look at the strengths and virtues that help individuals and communities to thrive. And we will definitely talk about positive psychology later in the year. Okay, now the biopsychosocial approach and the theoretical perspectives. So, a lot of psychologists take the biopsychosocial approach, meaning when looking at a problem, especially let's say a person goes to a psychologist and they are trying to get some help. The psychologist might look at them through a biopsychosocial model, meaning they're going to look at what are the biological elements that could be contributing to these disorders. So maybe they have a disability, maybe they have brain abnormalities, maybe they have some genetic issues, maybe they have had a traumatic brain injury, things like that. They will also look at the psychological element. So they might look at their coping skills, their self-esteem, their social skills, their trauma, family relationships, stuff like that. And then the social element is looking at one's social environment. So if a person is living, let's say an impoverished lifestyle, that would be part of the social aspect that a psychologist would take into consideration when trying to understand a patient's issues. Now, the basic perspectives in psychology are these as follows. So, behavioral. First, behavioral, what they mainly focus on is observable behaviors and how those behaviors are learned. Okay? That's behavioral. And we're going to go into depth with all of these later throughout the year. But this is kind of the gist at the beginning. Biological psychologists, they focus on the bodily processes and biological processes that could cause all different types of behavior. Cognitive focuses on how a person thinks about a situation and how to alter that thinking. Evolutionary focuses on how this trait may have arisen from evolution because it enhanced survival and reproduction. Humanistic focuses on human growth potential and reducing issues that limit growth. Psychodynamic or psychoanalytic, that focuses on what unconscious factors could be causing behavior. So, like, unconscious desires or unconscious traumas that one suppressed. And then social cultural is a perspective that focuses on how one's culture and social environment could drive behavior. So, for example, why is there a lot of gang activity in certain parts of the neighborhood? Well, a social cultural psychologist would look at the factors that play into that and be able to explain that behavior. Okay, so how to use psychology to become a strong person and better student. So here are some basic research suggestions that psychologists have found actually are true. First of all, you need to sleep. A lot of my AP kiddos, I know you guys are stressed. You're doing a bajillion things, but you have to sleep. This is critical. Exercise is very good. Obviously, we talk about this. You've heard it before. It's just good for your physical health as well as your mental health. Set long-term goals with daily aims. So maybe your goal is to get an A in my course. Set that as your long-term goal, but set daily goals too. I want to get this and this done by today. Have a growth mindset. So don't just think, if you don't do well on the first test, don't think I suck at psychology, because that's not true. This is your first test. You need to have the understanding that people can grow. Your knowledge can grow and you can do better. And I've seen that time and time again with my students. Prioritize relationships. Relationships are really important to humans. We are evolutionary, adapted to be social creatures. So make sure you have some good friends or family or someone you can trust and talk to. Now, how to be a better student. So basically the gist is test yourself. The more you test yourself, the more you'll remember later. This is called the testing effect. It's better than rereading. It's better than just rehearsing. It is the best way to remember information. So we're going to be doing lots of testing and quizzing in this class, not because I want to punish you and make your life miserable, but because I want you to succeed and I want you to remember for the bigger tests, like your finals and the AP exam. So we're going to be doing lots of little quizzes in this class. Actively process information. Make connections to stuff. If you're like, when I hear about this, I think of this. Write that down. Make that connection. Own this material as your own. And then make sure you're not cramming. Cramming, research has shown, is not very helpful in the long run. You're not going to remember the material at the end of the semester that you're doing at the beginning if you're cramming. You need to distribute your study time evenly. And again, overlearn. Just test yourself repeatedly. We find in research that is what is best. Okay, so I want you to test yourself. I want you to answer these questions in your notes, and we will talk about them on class day when we're together. See ya!